Hey, welcome to my channel. My name's Lucy and I really like to build things. And right now I'm working on an NV2500 and I'm going to turn this into a little kind of weekender RV. The NV2500 only has about 9 feet of usable, livable space in the back, so the ability to sleep sideways is extremely important in order to save enough of the other floor space for, cooking and whatnot. So the investment was worth it to me. However, my budget didn't support having these professionally painted and professionally installed, so I'm going to do the work myself. So these come primed and ready to paint, but I still wet sanded them at about 600 grit just to make sure that everything was really nice and smooth. And then, of course, you want to wipe down and make sure you get all of the dust off before painting. For the paint, I'm just going to use a rattle can that I got from the automotive paint store, and it is a color match Nissan Dupli color. And the color is not exactly perfect to my van, but my van's also pretty old and beat up, so that's quite all right. I'm going to probably end up repainting or doing plasti dip or something over the whole thing at some point. And I will say the body flares look certainly better than the body on the van itself when I'm done with this. I applied 4 coats total, and I used an entire can to do a coat. So 4 cans total to get this job done. I watched several videos for technique for painting these, so you'll notice that sometimes I'm doing, kind of like working in a foot segment at a time and then finishing with some longer strokes. It would have been nice if I'd been able to kind of have these propped up so I didn't have to keep working my way around it, but it still worked out quite well. There are several people on YouTube who specialize in painting automotives, particularly with these rattle cans, so I recommend that you watch their videos before you do this. I'm not going to pretend to be the expert at this. However, after 4 coats, I did end up with a really nice finish. For the clear coat, I opted to go for the 2K stuff, and this really is a professional grade clear coat. And so on the bottom, you have to kind of give it a little pop, and that mixes the hardener into it. So you do really end up with just like, what a car would actually have. It's a little bit more expensive, but certainly worth it. But it is some pretty potent, strong stuff. So you want to make sure that you are protecting yourself. This might be the only time in my life where I really did shake the can as long as it recommends. This stuff sprays out really smooth. It's actually really nice to work with. So you get a nice even coat, and I just overlap about 50% of the path before, and worked out really great. So I went through 2 cans total of this. Notice that with this and with the paint, I have a paper towel in my hand, so I'm able to wipe off the tip so it's not building up stuff and starting to get any splattery mess on the project. I allowed 10 minutes of drying time between coats. That was the recommendation from the kind that I use, so just make sure that you read your can and follow whatever the instructions are. I applied 3 coats total of clear, and it took 2 cans to do so, and I ended up with a very nice finish. My van came with all this spray insulation already in it because I live in Arizona, and so I did try to keep some of it throughout the van because it was free insulation, and I used Thinsulate to also insulate the van, but in order to get these flares in, I did have to remove all of it from the 2 window openings where the flares were going to go. It was a tedious job, so I won't bore you with it anymore. So if you've made it this far, you're probably freaking out because you're about to cut holes into your van. I know I certainly was. So you definitely want to get the long blades, okay? And Bosch makes these 5 1/4 inch long, and that's because when you're going around corners like this, you want to be able to pick up the back of the saw and keep the nose in, then you're able to make it around the curve. The nice thing is that the saw does ride right along the ridge for the straight parts, and that makes it actually a perfect distance away. But the curves do get a little bit challenging. So the long blades make this extremely easier. And that was a tip that I picked up from Our Thriving Life channel. So thank you very much for that. He recommended having 2 blades, 1 for each window. I don't know if I just was less perfect in hitting, kind of the edge of the thicker part of steel or what, but I definitely needed more blades than that. So I recommend that you get 2 3-packs so that you have at least 3 for each side. I probably could have gotten by with 2 on a side. Luckily, I had some shorter ones that I used for the straightaways. Now you'll notice the window is shaking like crazy here, so it's nice to have a helper on the outside start to apply tape to the parts that have been cut. So you'll notice that we do that, and that's going to help a lot. All right, so we're going to jump over to the other window where we had our technique down better. We start putting tape on the outside a little bit earlier. Notice that I do have tape and plastic down, and this helps to keep the metal shards from being able to get into those open cavities and, eventually being able to cause rust in there. So on this side, I did pre-drill several spots along the way, and this was because I realized that, once I got to an area and I took my blade around and went from one side, it was sometimes easier to go in from a hole from the other side where it was able to have that hole saw nice and flat and come back from the other angle. So by having some of these spots where I was able to flip which direction I was going rather quickly was very helpful. So on this side, I had my technique a little bit cleaner for being able to do the curves. So this first curve, the angle's not the best, so I will show you on the second curve, but see how I'm going to start with the small blade here so that I was able to save my long ones for the curves because I had only had 1 3-pack of those. So after I've switched out the blade, now I'm going to be able to go ahead and go up to the curve, and notice how I'm just going to bring the back end of it up, and that's going to make life a lot easier. All right, hopefully this angle you're going to be able to see this technique even a little bit better. Now, notice how I have nice gloves on. That's important. There are some sparks. You definitely want to have safety glasses on. Hearing protection, it is very loud. Notice how we've taped from the outside again to hold this in place. It wouldn't even be a bad idea to have a face shield. I, didn't seem to mind the metal hitting my face because I don't have one, but it's not a bad idea. But see, notice how it feels. As long as you keep the nose down, you're actually able to get around that corner nice and tight. And then by having that little relief hole there, I'm able to put my blade back in and run back the other direction with my saw nice and flat to just clean up the top edge a little bit. Keep in mind that there is a little bit of room for error. The lip on the Flarespace is over 1 inch, so you want to get as clean of a cut as you possibly can, but don't stress out too much if you, end up into the factory edge just a hair or have a little bit extra sticking out. We're going to file it down at the end too, just to make it a little bit nicer. Notice that the frame that I'm coming up to, that I have a blue line on there, so I did take a Sharpie and mark those lines so that I would be able to make sure that I was staying perfectly straight, even though you're pretty much just riding the edge of the saw on the curve. Of course, I was in constant communication with the person on the outside applying the tape so that I didn't cut her. But that you can see that this helps make it stay up there so you don't end up with this, sheet metal flying as soon as you finish cutting it and it, scratching the side of your van. So this worked out really nicely. So next I just filed the edges to make sure that I got any little burrs or anything knocked down, make it just a little bit smoother. Then I cleaned up all of the metal shards, and I was really happy that I put the flares in before I put the final flooring in. Next, you want to make sure that you prime all of the edges so that there's not any exposed steel to rust. It doesn't really matter what type of metal paint primer you use for this. So to prep the outside, I'm first going to wipe everything down with mineral spirits, and then I'm going to scuff up the surface where we're going to be adhering these with a 220 sandpaper. And then you want to come back over and clean it again with the mineral spirits. Make sure that you don't have any dust or anything. Per Flarespace's instructions, I'm going to run over the ridge. First, I sand it with a little bit of 220 again, and then I'm going to run over this with rubbing alcohol. For this step, again, you want to follow the instructions. So I cut back to a 3/8 inch opening and then cut a little V in the top so that the adhesive came out in a nice triangle. So next you just try to get a nice thick and consistent bead around the entire edge here, kind of on the inner side of the edge. Now this accurately represents what I feel like how long I feel like things are going to take in my head when I start a project. So to prep for the install, we put tape around where the flare was going to be, hoping that any extra that would, come out, we'd be able to get pretty easily onto the tape. I don't know that this was really necessary. It cleans up really well with mineral spirits. And then we had several pieces of tape ready to go in just kind of up top there, and that was helpful. Then you just want to, as carefully as possible, try to line this up and just put it on there, and then just try to hold it for a little bit and then get the tape on as quick as you can. Push down all of the edges. This stuff, once it sticks, it sticks. So there wasn't really, much for repositioning after we really pushed it down. So the front edge, there just wasn't a great way to tape it down, and I wanted that to be super tight because that's the direction that the wind would be coming. So I have these little magnetic little switches that I use in woodworking all the time. And so as we apply the second one here, I'll show you again how I use those to help keep the tape a little bit tighter there. So I applied the tape, pulling it as tight as I could. So there's going to be a little bit of airspace over where the gap is. And I did 3 rows of this, mostly because I have 3 mag switches. And so these magnets are extremely strong, and you can twist them on and off. So once I lined it up, then I just twisted to the on position, and it stuck very nice and tight to the van, and it pulled that tape in as tight as could be. Now I found actually that Harbor Freight paint tape works best for any clamping. It's pretty strong stuff. It probably makes it terrible as painter's tape, but for holding things, it actually works really awesome. So I'm using a tube here to be able to get the adhesive into the couple of inch gap. You have to kind of push it in about 2-3 inches. And that worked out well. I think I had a 3/8 inch tube. I probably should have had at least a 1/2 inch tube, but this is just what I happen to have in my shop. So you do want to, make sure you seal everything and then just clean it up with mineral spirits at the end, and that's pretty much the install. So in the next video, I'll show you how I upholstered the inside of these, and that process actually went fairly well. So anyway, I'm very happy with my Flarespace bumps, and it will allow me to keep that extra space in the van. So for me, with as short as my van is, it definitely is worth the investment. Thank you so much, and I hope that you follow along and enjoy the rest of this conversion.